This morning, I woke up thinking about a letter to the editor that I cut out of our local newspaper on June 10th, 2010. 10 years ago, I had it framed. It described history that should be remembered. And we'll get back to that letter specifically in just a minute. But today, obviously, I'm also thinking about our upcoming holiday. You know, when I was growing up, the 4th of July wasn't just an excuse for a long weekend. Do you remember? The 4th of July was one of the big four holidays, and it was uniquely celebrated. Thanksgiving held lavish feasts and football, and Christmas was for hot chocolate and a manger that we actually got to put a tree inside the house. Easter meant new shoes for church, new shoes that my mother liked and I didn't. I remember a particular pair of white ones that I really hated. But Independence Day was totally different. Firecrackers, homemade ice cream, ribs on the grill. We spent long summer evenings at the lake or at a swimming pool or even in our own backyards. I noticed then that everything about the 4th was more relaxed. It wasn't all timed out. Daddy cooked. Mama laughed with her friends who walked around in their baggy Bermuda shorts, drinking lemonade out of that special pitcher that was just for the adults, while we caught fireflies or hit sweet gumballs over the fence with a wiffle bat. Mama and Granddaddy were always there, and so were my other grandparents, Nana, Daddy Mac. Families, sometimes whole neighborhoods would gather. It's like pausing to connect in a way that seems almost embarrassing now. Grandmothers fed kids they didn't even know from their own plates after they'd already had the spoon in their mouth, and they shushed anyone who dared object. One daddy might teach another daddy's boy how to stand when he held a bat or how to make a sound with only his hand and an armpit. Children fell off swing sets and cried like their legs had been cut off, but nobody threatened to sue anybody or even acted mad. Later, do you remember this, when it was completely dark, when we were tired of catching frogs under the street lights, when the big kids had said goodbye and left in their cars to do whatever big kids did in their cars? This was a lot later, after all the black cats and bottle rockets and cherry bombs were used up, after the little kids had burned up all their sparklers. Much, much later, when the cicadas were droning in the darkness, the grown-ups gathered together. It always seemed an impromptu moment to me, but it happened every 4th of July, so maybe it wasn't. The location varied, maybe over by the side of the house to catch the breeze, but we kids could hear the adults closing that lazy circle as the aluminum lawn chairs scraped across the concrete driveway. Lighters flared, more lemonade was passed around as we crept closer to the proceedings. It was a fact. It was known by all the kids and passed down through generations of kiddom that if we could just stay quiet, if we could snuggle in close to the bare, sunburned legs of our mamas and daddies and stay still, they wouldn't make us leave. No one would tell us to go to bed. Sometimes, if we waited long enough, laying there on the cool concrete or in the damp grass in our still wet bathing suits smelling like chlorine and barbecue sauce, we would get to hear our grandparents talk about the time during the war. And quietly they would remember out loud about crackly newscasts from Europe and victory gardens and the ways folks helped each other here at home. They talked about places like Italy and France and Saipan. I remember Saipan because that was where Timmy Underwood's granddaddy had fought. It's a neat word to me, Saipan. I remember saying it several times when I heard it, just because it was just so unusual. Saipan, Saipan. It seemed dark and wet and mysterious. And sometimes we fell asleep. There was somebody's grandmama propping her worn-out barefoot on our backs or our legs as we listened to their soft old voices drifting through the hot summer night. Fireworks booming in the distance. Saipan seemed far away. It's even farther away now. Our sons, Austin and Adam, lost their last grandparent when Polly's mom, Patsy Jones, passed away. The boys were 8 and 10 years old when she passed. Today, they're 18 and 20. The true stories of our greatest generation are fading now as their souls leave this earth. There no longer seems to be time or even a desire for families and neighbors to gather and love and listen to each other. Our backyards are barricaded with prefab fences and shrubbery barricades. Our homes don't welcome visitors with front porches anymore. And our older citizens seem to be increasingly disregarded. Perhaps it's an oversight, but no matter, this vast pushing aside that society facilitates of those now in their 8th or 9th decade of life is a tragedy. Not necessarily for them, but definitely for us. Without consideration for the consequences, we are allowing them to be silenced. Our schools, our city councils, our churches, you and I, are looking the other way as the greatest generation of citizens our country has ever produced quietly take their unique wisdom to their graves. It has to be understood that these men and women possess a historical perspective that cannot be purchased at any price, and time's running out. They've earned a level of wisdom and understanding that we ignore at our own peril. And I know you might say, well, exactly what is that peril? Perhaps our greatest risk is a civil society in which to work and live and raise our families. You think that's an overstatement? Have you watched the news lately? Many of the greatest generation who are still with us say that while things like kindness, sacrifice for others, and forgiveness are not yet extinct, they have certainly become endangered. As an amateur historian, I know how easy it is for history itself to be rewritten. Those with any agenda at all can shift and change an event to make it to the point of their reporting or their movies or books. Knowing this, we can't merely sit back and allow ourselves to be informed by those with narrowly focused agendas. If we truly desire what's best for our nation, what's best, we must gather the courage to honestly pursue a unique perspective in today's world, the unvarnished truth. Why is the unvarnished truth so important? How can a child of today gain the wisdom to create their best future if they lack context and perspective about the past? To build a best future requires accurate context and proper perspective. Two things that can't be gained without taking into account the truth about our past. Now, does that mean that we're obligated to sweep away all the undesirable memories? No. In fact, strong memories of where someone or a group of people went wrong are critical to not repeating those actions. In 1945, when General Eisenhower was asked why he was sending photographers to document every aspect of what the liberators were finding in the Nazi concentration camps, he replied, "Why? Because one day some son of a bitch is going to say that this never happened." He was right. Despite the evidence, despite the photographs, there are now those who loudly deny the Holocaust ever took place. And there are those who quietly believe them. It's important to note that presented history in all forms, book, monument, article, or movie, and to remember that history's purpose is not always to honor. History, when presented in its unvarnished truth, also has great value to us as a cautionary tale. History, as the cliche goes, is what it is and should be related, heard, and seen that way. To treat history any other way is to ignore its lessons. In other words, experience is not the best teacher. Other people's experience is the best teacher. And that is, in fact, what history is, other people's experience. This 4th of July, I urge all of us to take advantage of the lives and wisdom in our midst before it's too late. In our neighborhoods, let's endeavor to find these 80 or 90-something-year-old Mr. Billy Stimpsons or Mr. Cliff Callaways or Miss Violet Cowden, who flew a P-51 Mustang during the war. Let's give our children the opportunity to learn from the best among us. Let's encourage our older friends to tell our children the unvarnished truth, to tell our children what it still means to them when someone salutes our flag. We need to ask them questions in front of our children. Were you scared? Why did you fight for our country? How did people act when you got home? Back to that letter to the editor I mentioned earlier. I told you I'd had it framed. I had it framed to inspire me, to encourage me. But really, I framed it for my boys. I want them to read it every now and then, and for years to come, when I'm gone, I want them to remember the truth about those who went before. I want them to know that one can choose the way in which we live our lives. We can choose how we disagree, whether or not we hold a grudge or forgive, that we can choose to sacrifice time or money or life itself so that our families or another person whom we might never know may prosper. I want my boys to be grounded in the simple examples contained in the wisdom of our grandparents. And that includes the words they choose to use as adults. And that's why I framed the letter to the editor. It's just one tiny piece of truth that reminds me that there are pieces of truth that have been forgotten already. One day, it will be important for my boys to read and understand. With permission, I'd like to read that short letter to you now. Dear Editor, I'm an 88-year-old veteran of World War II who served proudly with the 1st Marine Division in Okinawa and China. As I viewed the recent series, Pacific, on HBO, I was angry and embarrassed at the constant use of the F word while depicting Marines in battle. I went into the front line in Okinawa on May 9th, 1945, with the 1st Marine Division. The fighting could only be described as pure hell. But I never heard the F word. We lost 70 of our 160 men in one push. And I never heard the F word. During 6 days of vicious fighting at Kanishi Ridge, I never heard the F word. It may be commonplace for people to use that word nowadays, but it was not commonplace during the 1940s. I resent the fact that modern movies shed a disrespectful light on the Marines and those of us who were actually there. We've been called the greatest generation and given honor flights to Washington, D.C. We are not the generation who spoke the F word in every other sentence, even when in battle. Please help me set the record straight for history. H. Paul Bailey from Lillian, Alabama. Happy 4th of July, you guys.